Hi, I'm Lindsay Hull, Head of Thought Leadership at S&P Global Sustainable One.
And I'm Esther Wielden, a Senior Writer on the Sustainable One Thought Leadership team.
Welcome to ESG Insider, an S&P Global podcast where Esther and I take you inside the environmental, social, and governance issues that are shaping the rapidly evolving sustainability landscape.
If you listen to this podcast, you've probably heard us talk a lot about COPs this year. These are the UN's conferences of the parties that bring together world leaders, along with civil society, business, indigenous peoples, youth, philanthropy, and international organizations for about 2 weeks.
And the UN's big annual climate change conference, known as COP29, wrapped up in November 2024 in Baku, Azerbaijan. I had the chance to be there in person, and I spoke to a lot of people while I was there. It's always a challenge to sum up such a sweeping event, but there are a couple of key outcomes we'll be covering in today's episode, as well as in some upcoming episodes. Now, this is widely known as the Finance COP, and a key takeaway, as we'll hear today, was the establishment of a new collective quantified goal, which is a new and awful acronym for our listeners, the NCQG. We'll hear more about this today, as well as about other key outcomes related to transparency, adaptation, and carbon markets. And we're going to be hearing about this from Marcos Neto, a leader at the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP. This is a UN agency that operates in about 170 countries and territories, working to eradicate poverty while protecting the planet. UNDP helps countries develop policies, skills, partnerships, and institutions so they can sustain their progress. And Marcos has a unique perspective on COP29, as well as on COP30, which takes place next year. It's an event that's already drawing a lot of attention from the public and private sector alike. And as you'll hear, Marcos grew up in the Brazilian town of Belém, which will host next year's Climate COP.
So my name is Marcos Neto. I'm an Assistant Secretary General at the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, and the Director of the Bureau for Policy and Program Support. I'm Brazilian from Orange, born in the city that's going to host the next COP.
You were born
I was born in Belém, in the Amazon region of Brazil, and that has profoundly influenced my trajectory, my thinking in terms of issues of sustainability and things like that, having born and spent my childhood in the Amazon, by the river.
Okay. Tell me more about that. Like, how does that influence what you're doing now today?
Oh, it's a small town for Brazilian standards, right? And it's a town that it's totally linked to the forest and linked to the Amazon River, right? So we are very close in Belém to the delta of the river. Right, so there's water, just non-stop water everywhere. There's a very famous and a very beautiful, next year if you come to COP, you'll see fish market right by the river called Ver o Peso. And I used to go with my grandfather there a lot of Sunday mornings. And you see the fish coming, you see, poverty. The Amazon is one, if not the poorest part of Brazil to this day. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Brazilian government has decided to take the COP to the Amazon, to Belém, to show that this is all about finding a way that a country like Brazil, a region like the Amazon, can develop economically, socially, while at the same time preserving the forest and reducing emissions. But you can't really create a trade-off between the two, right? There are 27 million people who live in the Amazon. They need a development. And now if the forest has a value standing, and my grandfather was an exporter of Brazil nuts. Now, if you look for a plantation of Brazil nuts, it's virgin forest, because the Brazil nut tree takes decades to grow. So what my grandfather did is he bought virgin forest and capped before anybody was talking about sustainability or any of those issues. So that's where my influence, both seeing poverty. When I was growing up, because it's by the river and it floods a lot and it rains a lot, right? The poor parts of town were all built on wood shacks, on what we call in Portuguese palafitas, which are basically raised on very narrow pieces of wood to allow the water to flood without getting into the houses, right? So it was, all those things. At the time, I never thought, but when you look back, you realize that they were an influence on what I ended up doing with my life. I'm a lawyer from training who has spent the last 30 years working development and climate change and things like that.
Well, thank you for sharing your personal story, which has clearly colored where you are today. And I do want to come back at the end of our conversation and talk more about Brazil and COP30 next year. But let's talk a little bit about where we are now in COP29 here in Baku. A lot of our audience will not be here. A lot of our audience will have never been to a COP. What should they understand about what's happening here in Baku?
Well, there is two ways to answer that question. There is a philosophical way to answer that question, right? Which is basically, we're trying to save the future of our kids, right? You have 3 kids, I have 2 kids. We are trying to save a meaningful, livable future for them. That's the philosophical answer. The practical answer, this is the finance COP. Right? What we hope to get out of this COP is a new collective quantifiable goal for climate finance. In other words, how are we going to collectively, that's why the name says collectively, because it belongs to everybody, how are we going to finance the transition to a decarbonized world, while at the same time helping most vulnerable communities and countries around the world, like small island development states, to adapt it to what is already a reality, right? Because even if we were to stop emitting greenhouse gas pollutants today, there's enough in the atmosphere to already create the havocs that we've seen. We can make different choices, and that's what COP29 hopefully will deliver to us, which is an agreement that the international community comes to terms that we need to move this transition, and we need to move faster, and it's going to cost money. But inaction is going to cost more. We know from a fact that for every $1 you put it down on prevention, you save $7, right, on responding to a crisis, to an emergency. But we're still not prepared to put the $1 down. And then we live with the consequences and the billions of dollars that have to be repaid. But it's worse than the billions of dollars. So in the next hours or days, we need to see the international community agree on a goal, which should be in the trillions, should count all kinds of resources, public finance, domestic finance, private capital, should all be part of this composition of this goal. We've been negotiating for years how the rules are going to work, and now text has been agreed for Article 6.2 and Article 6.4. Now there will be a few works on technical registry, interoperability between different carbon markets, avoidance and all the other technical aspects. But it's very good that we actually now have the rule book that can allow us to recreate a global carbon market, because it is part of this collectiveness, right? So certain countries that have more difficulty in decarbonize could be able to actually buy and sell carbon offsets, right? Now, a carbon market and a carbon offset is not a substitute for hard, difficult mitigation, or in other words, reduction of emissions, right? Carbon market should be used for residual, not as a replacement. Oh, I don't have to transition to the renewable energy because I can do the carbon offsets. That's not what it should be done. It should be there for what is left, right? But it's great that we have that agreed in Baku.
Quick note here, we're going to dive into carbon markets and specific outcomes from COP29 in more detail in an upcoming episode. For today, we'll just note that a key achievement was that countries agreed on details of how carbon markets will operate under the Paris Agreement. Marcos just mentioned Article 6.2, and here, the decision out of COP29 provides clarity on how countries will authorize the trade of carbon credits and how registries tracking this will operate. On Article 6.4, countries agreed standards for a centralized carbon market, which the UN calls good news for developing countries that will benefit from new finance flows.
Now, on the financing goal, this was the big number that everyone was holding their breath for towards the end of COP29. And the ultimate number agreed to was one that provided $300 billion in public finance annually to developing countries by 2035. The goal also includes a broader investment target of $1.3 trillion a year by 2035 from both public and private sources. All right, Lindsay, so is this viewed as a win then?
Well, it depends who you talk to. I've heard a range of views. On one hand, there are press releases touting the fact that this figure triples finance to developing countries. $300 billion is more than the previous goal of $100 billion annually to developing countries. But others say that number falls far short of what's needed. And they're also skeptical because even that smaller $100 billion number was a struggle to achieve. Here's Marcos again, talking about where the money in this new collective quantified goal will come from.
50% of whatever the final number is should be grant-based, while the rest could be on concessional loans or multilateral development banks, private capital loans, lending, and things like that. Now, that grant-based side is where we're looking from a north to south solidarity investment side. Mm-hmm. That number is a complicated right now because one of the things that it's clear here in Baku is that we can no longer count with the United States of America for the next 4 years at least, right? So this is putting pressure in the European Union, which doesn't want to be left alone. So there's the need for others to stand up.
Okay, you anticipated one of my questions, which is who pays this fill-in-the-blank trillions of dollars?
Yeah, I think if you look at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, this is supposed to be paid by Schedule A countries, which is the historical emitters, let's put it that way, OECD economies. But I think we're in a different world. You have to consider how other emerging economies, which are not in Schedule A, could contribute. And that's part of the conversation that is happening here.
In Baku, the recent results of the U.S. elections were a backdrop for many discussions. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement on climate change the last time he was in office, and he said he'll do so again. I asked Marcos, how will the political landscape in the U.S. and elsewhere impact global climate action?
I think it's reasonable to assume that the United States of America will pull out of the Paris Agreement, like it did in 2017, and that creates a vacuum, right? Both in terms of finance contribution, but also in terms of leadership. The U.S. has an important leadership and should exercise that leadership. Because in the U.S. vacuum, someone will step up. Someone will take those vacuum, right? We don't know who is going to fulfill that space or not. The energy transition is irreversible. So it is dangerous for the United States not to be in conversations like this. Because that is the future, right? You can stay behind holding your horses into old technology, old fossil fuels. The world will move forward. 1 in every 2 cars sold in China is an electric vehicle. It's a competitive nature of the United States that I think will be jeopardized for the future. Now, who else is going to pay? I think Europe obviously sees its responsibilities, other G7 economies. The question is, will some emerging economies show up in the next few hours or days and put some money on the table? We'll see.
Is it their role, these emerging economies, to put money forward?
No, they have never been. But I think, again, a vacuum has been created. You have to figure out what is the self-interest of different economies around the world in fulfilling this vacuum or not. I think the entire climate history of negotiations from the 1992 conventions is based on a principle of common but differentiate responsibilities, right? So you have a stock of emissions that pretty much belong to the West. Now, you have a new stock of emissions that have been put out there by new emerging economies. Now, they are developing economies. If you look for emissions per capita, the emissions of India are still very small per capita, right? 1,300,000,000 people, their emissions are very small comparing to emissions in the West per capita. In absolute terms, they're catching up, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that the configuration of the conversation eventually is going to have to change. But there's very little trust among the countries right now to actually try to change this configuration now. And a lot of the distrust comes around money, right? Mm-hmm. The developing countries were promised back in 2009 $100 billion a year, which is peanuts, by the way, right?
Billions, not trillions, we're talking.
Billions a year. That money never happened. So now you want to convince them that, no, don't worry, it's going to happen this time. How? Why? It didn't happen before. Now we're moving to trillions, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's difficult negotiations, they're very complicated processes. I think the interesting element here in Baku, and that is where the elements of a deal on the table are, is this balance between the new collective quantifiable goal, so the finance goal, and mitigation, ambitions mitigation, right? The developing world at the moment is saying, don't ask me to have more ambitions if you are not going to put the money on the table. Mm-hmm. And Europe and other industrialized economies are saying, we need more ambition and we need faster ambition, but I don't have the money. The level of mitigation ambition, and just to clarify, mitigation in the context of climate change is emission reductions, right, of greenhouse gas equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent. So that is the deal that's going to happen. Low amount of money, there's going to be low ambitions mitigation. That's a bad deal. Higher amount of money, there will be higher about the mitigation. That's a good deal. Mm-hmm. Now, my experience in those deals is that we have a romantic notion of international cooperation, international diplomacy. We think that those things always end up on a win solution, everybody's happy. The most likely scenario, this is going to end up on a lose solution with everybody unhappy. Mm-hmm. But that's fine, because everybody's going to have to give up on something, right? And somebody's going to have to give up on something that's very precious to them, and others are going to have to do the same. So you end up with an agreement in which nobody's happy. That's a good sign.
That's a sign that the compromise is working effectively.
Exactly.
Okay. Are there any conversations you've had that you can share with our listeners that have been especially enlightening or interesting to you since you've been here in Baku?
I think perhaps a couple of things I would highlight. One is a piece of work of us, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, where we are very involved, is on the support to governments to prepare what is called the nationally determined contribution. So the Paris Agreement was revolutionary in terms of how international negotiations and treaties happen. Until the Paris Agreement, most international agreements and targets and things like that were agreed centrally and then going down to the countries. The Paris Agreement says each country goes home and prepares an NDC and tells in your own reality how you are advancing towards staying within 1.5 degrees Celsius and so on and so forth. Right? So it's a bottom-up process. The Paris Agreement also realized that back 10 years ago, almost, next year will be 10 years of the agreement, that you would not get immediately the degrees of ambitions. So it built in a ratchet mechanism of the NDCs every 5 years. The first generation of NDCs, which were presented right in Paris, when you added all of them up, they put us on a trajectory of 3.5 degrees Celsius, way too high. Now, the second generation, which was presented in Glasgow, put us on a 2.5 trajectory. Now, by November, a year from now, at COP30 in Brazil, it is the third generation of NDCs. The expectation and the thing that we at UNDP are doing everywhere in the world is to make sure that we get to Berlin. And then the trajectory is 10 years after the Paris Agreement within 1.5 degree. That, for me, there's a lot of passion in Baku about the NDCs. If we can get a finance goal, I think we're going to be in good shape because, as I told you, we as UNDP, we've been asked by the UN Secretary General to lead the entire UN system in putting those NDCs together, in helping countries put those NDCs together. At an ambition level, which is 1.5 degree aligned, as an investment plan, so we're actually trying to bring costing to the NDCs because they didn't have. So how much is it going to cost the next 5 years to implement those? What are the financial strategies? How much of this money is going to be publicly domestic resources? How much is going to be international? How much is going to be private capital? So trying to put beginnings of financial strategy together with the NDCs. And the third pillar that is essential on our own, because we actually supported 128 countries in writing the second generation of NDCs. So we've learned a lot of what works, what it doesn't work. And the third pillar is very important because what we learn is that ambition is directly correlated with inclusivity. The more participatory the NDC processes are, business, women's, indigenous peoples, local communities, whole of government, the higher the ambitions are. Youth groups. So in our technical assistance, in our work with governments, we always try to say, look, let's convene and let's bring as much of society as possible to do this. The second conversation that I get really excited about here is a realization after 32 years that the three Rio conventions need to come closer together. You can't fight the climate crisis without biodiversity. And you can't preserve biodiversity in a world that is raging with climate crisis. And then there's a third convention that was signed up in Rio in '92, which people forget, which is the Convention on Desertification and Land Management. So I was in Cali just about a month ago on the Biodiversity Convention. I'm in Baku, and I'm going to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia for the Desertification Convention.
I should note here that the COP process is not without its critics. During COP29, for example, a group of former leaders and prominent climate experts signed an open letter calling for reform of the COP process, which they said is no longer fit for purpose, and they called for a fundamental overhaul of the COP. They said, quote, "We need a shift from negotiation to implementation, enabling the COP to deliver on agreed commitments and ensure the urgent energy transition and phase out of fossil energy," end quote. Here's Marcos again talking about how the three different COP processes work together. That's climate, biodiversity, and desertification. And you'll hear him introduce another gnarly acronym, NBSAP. That's a National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Okay, here he is.
What happened this year is that they were never put so close together. Literally, from the time the Cali began to the time Riyadh is going to end is 7 weeks, 8 weeks. It's not even 2 months, maybe 2 months, right? Mm-hmm. So that has created this perception, which excites me, that we have to look at those things in an integrated fashion, in an integrated way, right? So again, I told you about the work that we do as UNDP on the NDCs. We do a similar work with around 90 countries around the world on the equivalent of to an NDC to the Biodiversity Convention, which is a horrible acronym. It's called NBSAPs.
I actually just wrote that down today. I've been trying to brush up on all my new acronyms. That is a tricky one.
So one of the things we are advising governments now is unify the processes. Do an NBSAP and an NDC together. Now, you still have to present two documents because they are two different conventions, but don't do them in isolation. Do them together. Now, in Riyadh, we're going to get a land restoration or land management target to basically restore 1.5 billion hectares of degraded land. That target needs to be put together into an NDC and an NBSAP. Land becomes the common denominator, right? Land, huge amount of biodiversity is on land, forest, everything is on land, right? If you look at the perception of a trade-off between agriculture and forest. Now, again, I come from the Amazon in Brazil. That is a reality, right? But there are 30 million hectares of degraded land in Brazil. You don't need to cut a tree down. You just need to restore that 30 million hectares of land and let agriculture go there, right? So we can do those things. We can feed 8 billion people. Preserve the Amazon, right? Maintain biodiversity, and manage the climate crisis through land. So I got very excited, and there's a lot of conversation. There was a decision of the COP in Cali asking for synergies between the three conventions. There should be a decision similar here in Baku, reaffirming Cali's request for synergy, and one in Riyadh in 10 days' time, reaffirming that. And we as UNDP, we are in the primary position as advising to governments involved on NBSAPs and NDCs and land to actually make this work on the ground. And then it's not that you need less money. You still need a lot amount of money. But what you can do is that you can multiply the impact of every dollar. So you invest in land restoration, you're actually investing in agriculture, you're actually investing in reducing deforestation, you're actually investing in biodiversity conservation. That, for me, is where the magic is going to be, is that synergy, that integration. And you can even look at the three Rio conventions and find the synergy, and then extrapolate that synergy to the Sustainable Development Goals. And deal with inequality, deal with gender. And it is important. You know, women suffers more than men the results of the climate crisis. Disproportionately affected. But I would argue that you cannot solve this crisis foregoing 50% of the world's population. We need the ingenuity, the business acumen, active participation of women into the solution of this problem.
Marcos mentioned gender, and this was the focus of one of the thematic days at COP29. In Baku, countries reaffirmed the importance of gender equality and agreed to develop a new gender action plan for adoption at COP30. But according to Marcos, this represented very little progress.
There's a text that came out yesterday on gender. It's pretty much a status quo text on gender issues. There's very little progress, if you want, from the current framework that exists. It's a sign of the times that we live in. There has been a backlash on gender empowerments throughout the world. So it's sad to say that we might not see progress on the gender text, but at least we might not see regression. Sad, because we should always be seeing progress in those conversations.
You talked about NDCs and mitigation. I also wanted to ask about adaptation and national adaptation plans. Where do they fit into this whole landscape that we're talking about?
Again, we as UNDP supporting about 50 other countries preparing the national adaptation plans, including the Azerbaijani government, who presented its NAP, as it's called, in the beginning of the COP. Now, the national adaptation plan is a part of the NDC. So the NDC needs to cover both adaptation and mitigation. And again, part of this integration, you need to make sure that the national adaptation plans are not things that are sitting on the side in isolation from the NDCs. They actually need to be tied to the NDCs. So that's how they fit in that. The other interesting thing that this COP is the first COP that we are seeing the implementation of what is called the Enhanced Transparency Framework of the Paris Agreement. So for the first time, countries are presenting what is called the Biennial Transparency Report, right? Which is basically how they've been implementing the NDC. This is very important because it's a process of learning, right? So we are advising 45 countries in preparing the BTRs. Mm-hmm. And Azerbaijan and others have already presented the BTRs here in Baku. These BTRs are becoming invaluable data points, lessons learned points to the NDCs 3.0. So the NDCs 3.0 is going to be put together almost like a jigsaw puzzle. You got BTRs, you got NAPs, you got net zero targets for 2050. All of those things are going to come together, ideally in an inclusive process, whole of society process, to end up with ambitions 1.5 aligned NDCs. I'm proud of my team. I'm very proud of UNDP's role with our sister agencies of the UN and others partners in doing the lifting, if you want, between now the NDCs are supposed to be presented in February next year. Our expectation is about 20% of the countries might come to February. And then we move to September, and that is when they really need to be in, because our colleagues at the Secretariat of the Climate Change Convention, then do a synthesis report. And that is when I am optimistic that history will be made in my hometown. Because that is the moment that the world can, despite all the geopolitical troubles, despite the wars, despite everything else, and some questions about the value of multilateralism, we have an opportunity in November next year to show that the UN matters, that multilateralism matters, and yeah, it took 10 years, could have been faster, but the world has finally arrived at a trajectory of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, if it doesn't happen, then I think we are about to lose the Paris Agreement.
Lose, how so?
What is the value? Why, if we have an agreement that 10 years on cannot put us on the trajectory of 1.5 degrees, right? Is it still credible, right? Somebody said something this week in one of the, I don't know how many meetings I attended, that the challenge of climate change is we are not really negotiating climate change. We're negotiating our entire way of life. We've built an economy based on fossil fuel. And we are asking all of us to walk away from that to a new economy, which we are still building. And that is where it's very difficult, because you are negotiating your entire structure by which we've organized our lives since the Industrial Revolution. It's not easy, but we have no choice. There's no second planet, right? You and I have grown up the last 500 years, we're not that old, but the last 500 years with climate and the physical forces on planet Earth helping us, right? They've helped us. They have been benign, but they don't have to be benign. The history of this planet before humans was plenty of volcanic eruptions and tectonic shifts and this and that, right? We are now at the risk of creating a much more inhospitable planet for us and for our children and for their children. On top of everything else, AI and disruption in the economy and geopolitics and war, we are settling the future generations with an environment that is not going to be as benign as the environment the generations past have had, right? And climate change, it is going to become a direct link to conflicts. Transboundary wars because of water and droughts, and it would lead to migration. So it doesn't have to be like that. But that is, if we do nothing, that's the path.
So today we've heard discussion about some key outcomes from COP29. As we heard, the NCQG decision calls for all actors in the global financial landscape to scale up total financing to $1.3 trillion per year by 2035. And that's through a mix of both public and private sources. And that includes the so-called Baku to Belém roadmap to $1.3 trillion. This was agreed at COP29, and over the next year, it aims to scale up climate finance to developing countries to support low greenhouse gas emissions and climate-resilient development pathways, and also to implement nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and national adaptation plans.
Already a year out, there's a lot of focus on the road to COP30. As we'll hear in upcoming episodes, the private sector is increasingly showing up to these conversations. And also, a lot has changed in the carbon markets and in sustainable finance. We'll also look at how different stakeholders across the private and public sector are collaborating to drive climate action. So please stay tuned.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of ESG Insider. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe, share, and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts.
And a special thanks to our agency partner, the 199. See you next time.